Yeah, absolutely.
Microwave can be a quick spray, wipe down. I mean, you can.
Yeah, she actually had some special wipes for it, but it was, it did take 5 minutes to do. Okay.
Oh, I get it.
It is 10 o'clock in the East. Do you know where your children are? Good morning, everyone. We are up to paragraph 647 of volume 8 of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And this particular portion is about synchronicity. And we're using this book, which is an abbreviated portion. It is not volume 8. It is a portion of volume 8, but it happens to be all about synchronicity. And so I am continuing to use volume 8, however, because all of my brilliant underlinings are in my big volume, which I bought used with no trouble whatsoever. So I urge you to consider buying either version. They both work, and the paragraph numbers are related to the paragraph numbers in the collected works of C.G. Jung, as we know. So good morning, Jordan.
Morning.
You're here. How are you doing?
Good. How about you?
Oh, a little breathless, but I'm otherwise pretty good.
We had a bunch of rain last night. It's trying to be freezing rain, and now it's still raining, but it's sunny over on the horizon, so it's nice Taos weather.
Yeah. Meanwhile, I had a breathtaking email from our goddess yesterday evening, and she, well, I can't even tell you. It was breathtaking, though, and it occupied much of my mind the last few hours. But all is semi well in the context of humanity. I'm using my banned books cups, so these are all banned books. I've already read Animal Farm into the YouTube channel. I might read more, because banning books is a fool's errand, and especially as I've learned in the last 4 weeks doing substitute teaching. Oh my God. The children simply ignore us when we tell them to turn off their iPhones and their computers, and they're getting the information they want to know. And I don't think their parents are using the parental controls very well on their computers, and so they get whatever they want.
Well, a friend of mine actually uses his parental controls, so when his parents, he's 40, but so when his parents come over, they can't watch Fox News and without the password. And the password is 666, and they won't. So he keeps them from watching Fox News by using his parental controls against them when they visit.
Well, I was heartened today because there's an article in the Washington Post today about how TikTok has posts going viral on abortion, and it is just beyond control. And TikTok has mostly users under 30, whereas what we watch on cable news, Washington Post claims that only people over 60 watch cable news, but the younger generation, the Gen Zers, are looking at TikTok. And so I'm going to have to think about how to include TikTok into my repertoire of social networking. I've been using Twitter, but now that Elon Musk is buying Twitter, I'm not sure I'm going to like the content or the way it's managed. So anyway, good morning, Ellie. So anyway, the TikToks are running about 2/3 in favor of abortion, and I will tell my personal family secrets. I'm going to tell these two secrets on TikTok later today. But on my mother on her deathbed, we spent 2 weeks together in her hospital room, which was one of the sweetest times I ever had with my mother. We talked about all kinds of things, but one of the things she told me is that there were two family secrets. One of them was that she had voted for JFK in 1960 against the will of my father. And then the other one was that my two grandmothers, who were Victorian women, both born before the beginning of the 20th century, had had five abortions between them in the 1920s. And both of them raised three beautiful children as well. And so in the 1920s, they were committing felonies and their doctors were committing felonies. So when we ban abortion, we simply brutalize our society because abortions aren't prevented. They just go underground. And all kinds of bad things happen to women who have things like ectopic pregnancies and all kinds of other problems. So
It criminalizes. It makes criminals out of people's personal choice, which is invasive.
Hugely invasive. And just as we can't live by anyone else's religion because they're now 400 sects of Protestantism. So if you're not this kind of Protestant, you're going to hell. And my mother-in-law had that problem with her own sister, who was an evangelical, and her sister told her until the day of her death, well, I'm sorry, you're not going to be with us in heaven. And what a damnable thing to say to someone, especially to a beloved sister.
Well, and that's I'm pardon me, I'm always amazed at the amount of normalized shaming behavior that a lot of ecclesiastical attendees, as it would be, engage in. And I would suggest, though, on TikTok, when you use the word sex, to make sure it's S-E-C-T and you spell it. Otherwise, people they're not going to understand what you're talking about.
I know. I've already had that problem in school this week. talking about some of this stuff.
Sex and history.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go on with synchronicity. We're on paragraph 847 of the collected works of C.G. Jung, volume 8, but it's still 847 in the little book as well. So, and this is the book that I think Jordan is using, but I'm using the big one because I already underlined it. Okay, 847. There is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases and the Rhine experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. Okay, now this is the two cases we should remind everyone. The two cases, one where the patient was in Dr. Jung's clinic and a beetle flew into the room and solved her mental block. And the other one was where a woman had a negative reaction to birds landing on the roof of her house. And so you'll get the gist of it here as we go on. All right, so paragraph 847. There is yet another psychological analogy between my two cases and the Rhine experiments, though it is not quite so obvious. And the Rhine experiments were experiments on ESP.
Mhm.
These apparently quite different situations have as their common characteristic an element of impossibility. The patient with the scarab found herself in an impossible situation because the treatment had got stuck and there seemed to be no way out of the impasse. In such situations, if they are serious enough, archetypal dreams are likely to occur, which point out a possible line of advance one would never have thought of oneself. It is this kind of situation that constellates the archetype with the greatest regularity. In certain cases, the psychotherapist therefore sees himself obliged to discover the rationally insoluble problem towards which the patient's unconscious is steering. Once this is found, the deeper layers of the unconscious, the primordial images, are activated, and the transformation of the personality can get underway. Okay, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a very direct, I think, example of the purpose of Carl Jung's work is to activate and access the nourishing qualities of the psyche.
Absolutely.
And I find that the way I explain the way, for example, tarot or divination or any of that works, it's gotten pretty simple. If I see Mary Cassatt's face in a tree or Einstein's face in tile, or I look at a tarot card or I look at a piece of art until I get to that one frame where I get the tingles, where I know I'm now witnessing beauty. That strikes a chord to resonate in my imagination, which rings the doorbell for the portal of the unconscious to get the creative wellspring to well up these nourishing contents into my psyche, often without words, but they become the heart of the matter that's an ablution or a cleansing and keeps the psyche healthy. And I think this example where, are activated and the transformation of the personality can get underway, in a sense, he's utilizing the primordial images, the archetypes, just like a gardener uses amending the soil to increase the fertile qualities of the soil so the plants can grow more.
Right. And you're bringing up a fundamental concept of Jungian psychology that bears repeating every time it comes up. And that is this. Let me remove my share background for a moment. None. Okay. So here it is. Okay. The purpose of Jung's whole psychology is to make accessible to us that healing power which resides in our unconscious. Now, this was a quote from Lawrence Jaffe in a book called, what is it called? Liberating the Heart. And it's page 41 of that book. And that's an excellent book if you can get it used. It's out of print, I regret to say, but it is an extremely valuable book if you can get a copy of it. Liberating the Heart by Lawrence Jaffe. But the whole point of what Dr. Jung is saying here is that the unconscious has a healing power, and the unconscious basically will help us adjust to any situation. And if somebody gets stuck, then we need to open the pathway to that unconscious. And this is why I call the doodle or the collage in art ways to open that up. Because when you're doodling, you are not trying to make any specific picture. You're just putting something on paper and gradually moving your pen around until you see what it means to you. And that opens the pathway. And you hear yourself think then. And it's not because you put any particular image on on the page, but it allows you to open up the pathway. So one of the very important points here is in the last sentence where he says in the last phrase, the transformation of the personality can get underway. So the point is that we are always changing throughout our lives. Obviously, when we're children, we're changing very fast. And so I'm seeing sixth graders, some of whom are up to my hip or up to my waist, and the others some of them are taller than I am. And the change that children go through at that age between like sixth and eighth grade is just incomparable, right? And your psyche has to arrange that to happen. But it's also arranging to happen all kinds of adjustments in your psyche. And that's what we're talking about here. So,
and also they're
yeah.
at that point, they're at a middle ground, which I would equate to a psychological scenic overlook. I mean, at 7, most kids, boys and girls, turn from being so directed and focused with the mother to the father. Well, that's because we have a patriarchal society. If we had a matriarchal society, they would be moving from the father to the mother. And in that 7 years, that switch usually happens around 7. And then at 14, as we know, there or prior, there's puberty, but your spot there at 6th to 8th grade becomes that place from the middle towards the end of the next 7-year piece, where they're now engaged, not in this is new, in we got this, and the body's taken over to then, and the psyche is taken over to go ahead and start to run rather than walk in the new phase.
Right. And I learned a valuable lesson from dealing with that age group actually on Friday, where I had 2 classes. And one of the things that comes up in that age is sort of contrariness. I know everything, mom and dad know nothing. And so in the first class I had this bunch, and they were just goading me incessantly. They were just doing all kinds of things to goad me, until finally I just shouted at them, "Shut up!" And boy, that really set them off. and so in the next class, it happened to be an art room where there were 2 very long tables side by side, so that it was very long length in the room. And the class comes in, and they all sat at one of the long tables. And I sat down at the other one, which happened to be in front of the whiteboard. And there was only one student who sat down across from me. And so I just said something about, I forget what it was exactly, but it was something about my first wife. And she said, "Oh, you've had more than one wife?" I said, "Yes." And so then she and I started to talk about the transition between leaving my first wife and remarrying my current wife, who we celebrated our 33rd wedding anniversary last week. And I had been married to another woman for 17 years, who was the mother of all my 3 children. And so she started to ask me about that. And so I started to talk about that, and it was very interesting. It was like birds on a wire. All of a sudden, all the kids from the other table started to come around and sit at my table. And so I decided, okay, I'm just going to talk to these kids and develop a rapport with them, which I did. And so one of the things that came up was that they were studying the Vietnam War. They asked me, "Were you in World War II?" I said, "No, I'm not quite that old." And then I said I was in Vietnam. And so it happened that they're studying Vietnam in their social studies class. And they said, "Oh, you're the best substitute we've ever had. And can you come and talk to our social studies class?" And I said, "Well, if I'm invited to do that, I will." And they said, "Well, we're going to social studies now. Can you come down and talk with us in our social studies class?" I said, "Well, if the teacher invites me, I will." But and it happened that I had a free period the next period. And so the teacher invited me, and I went down and spent an hour with then the social studies class talking about my experiences in Vietnam. And obviously I made a connection with that group, but I hadn't made the connection with the first group. But I learned a valuable lesson because I may be interviewed for a social studies job here coming up. Now,
well, what I like about that, what's so resonant to me, is you didn't step in and play the power game of, "Hi, I'm now your teacher." You had to show them your humanity and let them be the boss and, in a sense, interview you. And a lot of people can't get around the power struggle of, well, what if they don't? And I'm like, well, if you're supposed to be so in control, why are you so worried about being abandoned? So when you can step in like you did, then they see that, oh, this might be of interest. So then what happens is you're now conferred teacher, except instead of, you already had teacher, but it was a superficial title. But then what happened is you gave them a place for their curiosity and wonderment to be, oh, I'll hang out here. I'll hook the horse up and come in.
This is interesting.
This is interesting,
so
which is the first part of education.
Yep, that's a very valuable lesson. And so I had to experience it myself and so on. So there are a couple of points here that are made that are worth responding to. LP says, what about the conscious? Well, the conscious typically is built on a structure, which is our civilization. We're conscious of our civilization around us, and we're conscious of the books that are in our library, what have you. I have stacks of them around me, so much that I often can't find the right book. But those are all very rigid and conscious, and they guide your mind in a certain way. And so even the way you live, if you think you're hungry and there's no food in the pantry, then you have to go to the grocery store. Well, that's what you think of. You have to go to the grocery store. But 150 years ago, you would have thought of, sending your husband out into the wild to shoot a rabbit or something like that to get food for the family. And so it's very different. Civilization has come along in very different ways, but civilization is always channelizing. And so the thing about your unconscious is we're all born with the same equipment, basically, in our bodies. Everything that we need to become us is already there from the first day, just like an acorn becomes an oak tree. From the first minute that a sperm fertilizes an egg, we have everything that we need is present. But the question is, how does it get activated so that it becomes you as a man or a woman, and then how to, whether you're going to be tall or short, and all these decisions are made by a certain activation that goes on throughout your life, because we also replace all the cells in our body with some exceptions, like our brain. We replace all the cells in our body every 7 years. So your body already knows how to do that and does it without you ever thinking of it. And it makes billions of decisions for us every year. And so all that is done unconsciously. Well, your unconscious psyche which is just the part of you that runs what you think you know through your senses, that psyche has a self-regulating aspect to it. And that is in the unconscious, because in all civilizations, regardless of what your religious faith is, regardless of what civilization you come from, your civilization will take you away from your natural self. It makes rules, and sometimes those rules pinch, you don't like them. And that's when your psyche is telling you, oh my God, I don't like that rule. And so the question is, do you live by that rule or do you not live by that rule? And sometimes the rules are good and sometimes the rules are bad, but your unconscious will start sending you messages if it's bad enough. Sorry about my cough.
No, and I think I'll address too, what about the conscious that LP had asked too. I'll go back to my gardening metaphor, where to me, the conscious, that's those plants and trees in the garden. And the unconscious is that soil and the unseen nourishment underneath that the plants reach to. So I think there's that interdependence or interrelationship between the way the conscious thrives based on being nourished from the unconscious. And also, I think that the conscious can deposit contents back to the unconscious, except when they do, I think that they're dandelion in a way that they're not going to plant in the unconscious. It's as if they're sent back to be disintegrated and come back as other forms. So I think I think the garden metaphor, even in cross section, the light above and the dark below,
right.
And then the plants that reach down to the darkness, the depths for nourishment, and then reach up towards the sun for growth and development. The plants and us and animals and trees and all that, I think, are that conscious part of that diagram, and that the unconscious part can stay unknown, but understand that you need to root in that depth and that shadow land, as it were, that's not negative. It's just dark because it's deep. And I think that abyss aspect, like a volcano, I think I can end up this comment on a volcano. It's like the volcano, its head continuously in the clouds, continuously making new lands here, and its feet are firmly rooted in the abyss. And I think that's that whole cross section of, to then address LP's, well, what about the conscious? I think it's those things we can see, touch, and think about.
Right. And so when you see that there's a revolution, the thing that history has missed largely, and in all the history courses I ever took, the history has missed the why, the psychological why. And so in every revolution, eventually the shoe fits too tightly, and you have to revolt against it in order to, when you're growing, if the shoe fits too tightly, you just throw the shoe away and get new shoes. And it's very much like that. Civilization will be a pair of shoes that are too tight for you, and you have to decide what is the balance that you're going to have in your own life, because it's not that we have 10 or 20 types of civilization around the world. It's that we have about 8 billion civilizations in the world, with each one of us making our own peace with what civilization we're willing to live with and what we are not willing to live with. And
your shoe becoming too tight is a really wonderful example of the king or queen when it's time to break the cup. When it's time for them or the kingdom to grow, they symbolically will smash a precious vessel. And that's a symbol of molting, of the chrysalis opening, of the snake shedding the skin, of it's time to grow. And what happens there is that Saturn quality, that, unbending traditionalist status quo piece now has to shatter, because the Uranian piece, the comfortable with the not knowing, is growing, and it will create its new structure after it has expanded past the previous one. And the structure is often similar, if not identical. But in the meantime, while it's growing, it shirks off, or throws off that yoke.
Right. So LP makes another comment here: changing between consciousness and unconsciousness, question mark. Yes, that's the point, that your psyche knows what's right for you, and it will offer things which sometimes are not right for you, and you have to make a conscious decision based on your knowledge of how you're going to live. Obviously, human beings are problem-solving creatures, and we have to learn what we can rebel against and what we can't. I mean, when you're in the 7th grade and you're rebelling against your parents, that's okay up to a point, but you can't live on your own. You can't buy groceries on your own, or not for very long, without your parents' support and without your parents taking care of you and providing lodging for you while you're growing up and learning. And so your unconscious comes up and helps you make that decision, because although you may have rebelled against your parents, very few people leave home before the 12th grade. And, so they do knuckle under to their parents to a certain extent, just enough to keep their parents from throwing them out of the house. And then gradually over the next 10 years, you learn how wise your parents were and are. Jordan, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, when I was 19, you should ask me everything when I was 19, because I knew everything then. And, my dad was wrong and this and that. And I remember at 25, I went, Dad, about 6 years ago, you just didn't get it. And I'm just amazed how much you've caught on in the last 6 years.
Right.
Yeah. And
right.
He just laughed. But I think back to LP's comment about switching between conscious and unconscious question mark. I don't think it's binary like that. I think it actually is. It's a continuous passage through conscious and unconscious. And my itty bitty baby diagram, or the DNA of my idea of it, is that we experience the unconscious all the time. Now, that sounds kind of hocus pocus in a way, like, well, how are you going to substantiate that? But just from neurobiology, if I take one neuron, one nerve cell, and it fires off this lightning strike across the synapse, well, that's a little mini abyss. And that's an unconscious, that's a depth, an interstice, a space between that's not touching. And then it lands on the other neuron, the other nerve cell. What I see happening is, because the first neuron fired across the unknown, that's 50-50 conscious, unconscious. And then when it lands on the other one, I made a connection. And so that's the wheel turning, as it were, of, I think, the conscious and unconscious at a very, very minute level. When we speak, when we listen, when we hear, when we're silent, when we meditate, even when we sleep, the brain is working. And so I look at that 1, 2, 3, where in the initial impetus, the unconscious is half the story. And in the end, in connections, the unconscious is 30% of this, 33% of the story.
And part of the rule is that you need to start to recognize how your unconscious is communicating to you. That's the point. Right. And so one of the things that I will be doing in my social studies classes, if I get the social studies job next week, is I will be urging people to doodle all the time. Doodle in class. You're encouraged to doodle in class. And And the reason for that is by doodling, you are getting something up out of your unconscious. It's not about what the picture that you're drawing. It's about something else that's communicating with you, and you start to hear it. And that is very valuable to you, no matter what. Now, Abraxas says they know everything except how to control themselves. Yes, that's true.
Well, and that brings up a point, I think,
right.
from a parenting standpoint. I remember a friend of mine's son was 6, and he was just going ballistic nuts. I mean, like kind of random wiggly all over the place. And he just bounced literally. And I just looked over at her and I said, "May I?" And she said, "By all means, I don't think there's anything you can do." And I just grabbed him by the shoulder softly and I lifted him up high enough to where he couldn't kick me in the groin and flexed my stomach. So when he did kick me in the stomach and chest accidentally, and I just held him against the wall and just gazed into his eyes, just directly, quietly, no words, no force. And finally, he chilled out and I set him down. He goes, "Thank you. I don't know how to do that." And I said, "You just did." So next time, if you can make yourself still, I said, don't imprison yourself. Well, he started self-regulating, but no one had shown him that he was capable, so he assumed he was incapable.
Yeah.
And I think that just that thing of they have all the tools, but they don't know how to. I think it's true, but they can be taught.
Right. Okay, so Susan says, my favorite teacher was a history teacher in the 6th grade who started every class with a current events discussion, bringing history into it. Well, Susan, times have changed, and in our county, we are not allowed to talk about politics at all, and we are not allowed to talk about religion. So it was very interesting that in one of the social studies classes I taught last week, they did have to talk about the Reformation and Martin Luther and why he was splitting off from the church. But what they didn't talk about is what the consequences of that were and why that happened. And part of the answer to it is that it's human nature, that whenever you have a boss, all bosses are, how can I say this without saying assholes? You always resist your boss in any hierarchy. And so eventually some members of the hierarchy will split off and rebel. And so in the Catholic Church, they held the control of civilization for about 1500 years. And then along came Martin Luther in 1517, and he says, well, enough of this indulgences business where priests are selling freedom from your sins. Only God can free you from your sins. And so he split off, and the result of that was that on the Protestant side, it kept splitting and splitting and splitting. And so now there are innumerable Protestant denominations. And of course, the major ones are Lutherans following Luther, but Calvinists who are Presbyterian and Reformed and so on. And they kept splitting and splitting and splitting, so that now there are at least 400 identifiable Protestant denominations. On the Catholic side, there are 5. And so that is, and maybe more. I simply am ignorant of the more. So anyway, but the issue is how do we teach social studies without talking about politics? That is a big question. I guess one of the answers is that we have to stick to historical events and talk about. Go ahead.
I think the psychology too of most bosses, people are like, oh, God, they're just sociopath or narcissistic sociopath. no, it's all business. They just turn the emotion off. So the thing is, they make a command that's stern. People interpret it as if they're in trouble, like their parent is telling them what to do. That the problem is that they're an a-hole kind of piece comes from the fact that, that you're not the boss of me internally. I'm tired of that. I evolved, I grew up, I'm out of my parents' house kind of thing, except they still have that associative piece that triggers I don't like you very much because you're telling me what to do. And also because the boss is emotionless, typically in that expression, they have emotions, but they have a boundary too, which they maintain, and that's healthy. But what happens is then when they come in, drop you need to do this, well, and then they leave, you're left with all of your associations instead, and they basically were slippery and bulletproof because you weren't able to do anything other than attribute it to them, but you can't latch it onto them. There's no handhold, but that you won't let go of it. So I think what's interesting about a lot of businesses is actually your social studies example. When a boss sits down at the table with everyone as a team, and it's not that people cannot speak at, to, or against the boss. I mean, if you want to know who controls you, just look at who you're not allowed to insult. And that kind of thing happens where you get some companies where the team approach literally absorbs the boss. Now, the boss is probably going to make 26 times what everyone else makes. But at the same time, when they're present as just another part, then there's your general example that you had where, oh, there go my people, I must follow them.
Yeah, there's a balance, and in the Marines, there's an apocryphal story that the average life expectancy of a second lieutenant in a firefight is 15 seconds.
Oh, your video froze. Your video froze right after 15 seconds. I don't know if
everybody else uncomfortable, so he gets a bullet in the back of his head. But the real leader has to engage with his charges, but also sometimes make a tough decision. And so I recall this story in the Wall Street Journal one time where this guy who had been an enlisted man, corporal or something, said how shocked he was when his company commander was killed, because he always thought he was invincible when he was in Vietnam, but when that man died, he said, I was counting on him to get me home alive. And why is that? It's because the company commander has all the training of how to bring in air support and artillery support, you name it. Whereas a private or a corporal knows something about a rifle. And so he doesn't have the training, and even if he had the radio, he wouldn't know what to do to get help if he needed it. And
that's a great example of the lying to someone properly, where it'll be okay, and so they dispense with their fear and they proceed accordingly in a way that's safe for them. I remember martial arts instructor, I've done innumerable push-ups. I'm gonna throw up, I think I'm gonna die, and he's 10 more, just 10 more. So I do 10 more and I'm going to die, but he says 10 more. Somehow that made it okay. Like he's not going to push me to my death, until I realized, yes, he is, because he's going to see if I can actually steer away from the wrong order kind of thing.
Right. So Elle has said, can one be present while being unconscious? And I think that you can be present while looking at the unconscious and hearing the unconscious. And this happens in all kinds of meditation. My wife is just now in the process of completing up to 950,000 mantras in Tibetan Buddhism, and she intends to complete 1 million mantras of a certain type of mantra by 2 weeks from now, because she's going to a retreat with her lama, where she's going to give him her 1 million mantras. And the point about the mantras is she does it in meditation, and she experiences all kinds of things coming up from the unconscious during meditation. But in the Tibetan Buddhism tradition, you don't close your eyes, you keep your eyes open, and you're seeing all these things coming up in your unconscious separately. You can actually see them coming at you. So it's a meditation technique, but it makes you very wise, I think. And I said to her, well, you know, you're going to get to this retreat, and the Lama is going to tell you to do another 1 million. And she said, yes, she knew that. Because
that meditation
sometimes
is
they
important,
do that.
because to be able to see, sometimes at my table, I'll leave my lights on during the day.
Mhm.
And people sometimes ask, curious people will say, well, why do you have the lights on during the day? I said, seeing the light, in the light, the subtle nuance, that's more important sometimes than seeing the high contrast stars in the night sky.
Right.
And so seeing the dark in the dark, even learning, training how to operate at night, without any kind of equipment, where you can see in the dark. You're actually not looking for things, you're looking for darknesses, because things that are alive absorb light and they're darker than the surroundings. So you're looking actually for things that are less able to be seen than the things around. So
right. And Patrick Hollywood says, and thank you for being here, Patrick, today. It's great that you're here. Patrick happens to be one of the people who came to the confluence in Helena, and we had a good time that weekend. And he says, sort of like balancing a light switch between on and off, or as Jordan just suggested, recently I've been really recognizing my unconscious, so incredible, almost like my guide. That is wild. No talking about such things. Runs to make leaflets. The truth.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a good point, Patrick, too, because what I say is the unconscious is often the heart of the matter. It comes up and it doesn't need any words. It's like when a manager says, oh, go be creative. Well, they're kind of giving you time off in a way. They think you're creative. And they're like, okay, that's cool. That's a great idea. Now get back to work. Well, they demean the idea. But if you take that idea and you roll that in as the heart of the matter in your actions, it has no words. It's voiceless. But it's not voiceless. It's a driver. And
well,
so
it depends on who you are, because people hear their unconscious by words sometimes, and some by visions, and some by feelings. So
completely, but I think it's different than our speaking words. There's a whole different feeling sense of that archetypal language, that then listening to something that may be incomprehensible, being comfortable with the not knowing, but allowing that unknown as a driver. It's kind of like a taxi driver. I mean, I hop in a taxi and that's kind of the unconscious driving me around. If they're kind of Jim Jarmusch movie, the Italian guy who forgot to take his sunglasses off at night and then goes, oh, that's so much better.
Right.
I mean,
well, Patrick is saying not all bosses are the same. Manipulating the untrustworthy promises are red flags. Never taking any responsibility is another red flag. We are all learning, and that's absolutely true. Now, in the Marines, the issue is that at OCS, we intentionally put the officer on a pedestal. Okay. And so when the sergeants are training the officer candidates, they treat the probably first lieutenant or second lieutenant platoon commander as a god. Okay.
Right.
And unfortunately, officer candidates sometimes get the idea that they are gods, but in fact, you have 50 people that are working with you, and they're all a year or two younger than you, or maybe 3 or 4 years younger than you. Okay, because a second lieutenant can be 21 and a private can be 17. But the difference between you is not that red hot. And if you go around just giving orders and being very imperious, you're the guy that's going to get the bullet in the back of your head. But if you sit with your troops and help them understand what you understand, then, in the end, it helps them. I mean, one of the problems that we have in the Marine Corps is that we lose about 800 Marines every year. That's the equivalent of almost a battalion of Marines we lose every year, war or no war, to traffic accidents. Okay, in other words, they get off late on a Friday and they swoop to New York City from Camp Lejeune or something to that effect. And so they do a 10-hour drive in 7 hours, speeding all the way and maybe drinking a little, and they go off the road and get killed. And so one of the things that the Marine Corps does without fail is every Friday, the last thing they do before they release you is show movies of terrible traffic accidents to bring it to top of mind, so you're thinking about it at least. And so, you have to balance those sorts of things and sort of be a little bit ahead of somebody you're teaching something.
Well, that's a really interesting example, I think, too, about the importance of utilizing the pedestal as a psychological development tool.
Yeah.
But that's fine for training. But for example, in relationship, you put someone on a pedestal and that just makes it that much easier for them to kick your teeth right down your throat.
Right.
So what happens, though, by your example previously too, they're put on a pedestal to learn how to lead, but then that pedestal drops back into the group to lead from within, because otherwise the tallest blade of grass is the first to get cut, Right.
So Elle liked what I said because she's currently learning how to meditate. And, sometimes I argue with my wife about meditation because of certain aspects of my intuitiveness. I can just drop into meditation instantly. I had no problem learning how to be in that state. And, within 15 seconds, I can be in a meditative state. And you won't even know I'm there probably because my eyes are open as I'm doing it. But my wife cannot tolerate other sounds in the room or other light or whatever it is. And so she requires a certain amount of quiet in order to meditate, whereas I can meditate in a battle.
Well, I was just going to say, the thing is, you're trained in war. And so, for example, I remember putting my headphones on, heavy metal music in thesis studio, and that created a silent bubble. I mean, the intense war, as it were, of music around me made it peaceful right here. But that was, again, martial training. And then other people want the quietness that's larger. And for example, with meditation, I mean, I may play I'm meditating 50% of every thought, the conscious synapse, but I could not right now sit down or stand up or walking meditation, truly meditate in that state for an hour, because I'm not physically in that good of in that kind of shape. And it actually takes a lot of physical stamina to be able to do that, not fall asleep, not get just kind of on autopilot, and still actually not be on pilot either.
Yeah, and all of us get in a meditative state when we're driving a long distance. You know, if it's actually a kind of hypnosis when you're going to drive 30 miles or more on an interstate, you enter a hypnotic trance, a kind of trance where you're relying on everybody else to be driving correctly, and it's only if something happens out of the ordinary that you wake out of that. But typically you may be thinking of something else. You're not concentrating all the time on that red light in front of you or that pair of red lights in front of you. You're thinking about, what you're going to make for dinner or what have you. And so that's a meditative state, and that's also a hypnotic state. And as long
and that's
as
drone note, that's the long drone note of a well-crafted wooden flute. It's just a continuous experience that, you could say monotony, except it's not unpleasant. So it puts you in that kind of awake sleep. Right.
So Elle says semi-pro fi, which I'm not sure if you intentionally made a mistake, Elle, or whether you're talking about
correct is changing military Marine
Semper Fi, to semi-pro fi. I really love it, whichever it is.
Well, actually, but wouldn't semi-pro fi be Marine ROTC? Like they're not there
something
yet,
like that.
There, it's like the Bush Leagues.
Well, but it's also I'm not semi-pro though. I'm professionally fidelis. In other words, I'm professionally loyal to whatever group I'm working with. So currently, I don't get paid much money, maybe $100 a month out of doing these YouTube videos. But I get paid something, so I have to say I'm a pro at it. I'm professionally doing these videos, and
I like this profile. That's just
right. Absolutely, but obviously we have to be loyal to something in our lives. If we're not, then we're going to find ourselves in deep trouble. Because if you put yourself against all the world, then you're going to find an early grave, I'm afraid.
Well, I would qualify that. I think there's a Uranian piece that doesn't even care about the status quo, but will make its own system that works for itself. And in that sense, you're still, though, being loyal to your way and your being. So it's not something necessarily outside, but then you create a structure that works for you outside, except that's inherently within all the other systems. It's a cohabitant.
Right. Okay. So let's see. So Elle says she has a Marine colonel in her house. Okay.
So she is semi-pro-fi just by circumstance.
Right. I like it, Elle, and I'm just going to pass on all the other comments here for now with respect to Patrick, because we have to read a little bit more. So Jordan, what you read on here?
Yeah, I was going to say
848.
We got the record today. 1 hour, one paragraph.
Right.
All right, paragraph 848. In the second case, there was the half unconscious fear and the threat of a lethal end with no possibility of an adequate recognition of the situation. In Rhine's experiment, it is the impossibility of the task that ultimately fixes the subject's attention on the process going on inside them, and thus gives the unconscious a chance to manifest itself. The questions set by the ESP experiment have an emotional effect right from the start, since they postulate something unknowable as being potentially knowable, and in that way take the possibility of a miracle seriously into account. This, regardless of the subject's skepticism, immediately appeals to their unconscious readiness to witness a miracle and to the hope, latent in all people, that such a thing may yet be possible. Primitive superstition lies just below the surface of even the most tough-minded individuals, and it is precisely those who most fight against it who are the first to succumb to its suggestive effects, they who doth protest too much. When therefore a serious experiment with all the authority of science behind it touches this readiness, it will inevitably give rise to an emotion which either accepts or rejects it with a good deal of affectivity. At all events, an effective expectation is present in one form or another, even though it may be denied.
Right. Now, this brings to mind my life hack, which I've been telling my students about this week, which is how flipping a coin works. And the answer is simply this. You have a yes-no question, how to behave or what have you, and you flip a coin and say to yourself, am I better off listening to this teacher or not, let's say. Okay, so you flip the coin and you put up, you get your result. If your result is the one you want, you normally would stop there. But if it's not the one you want, you'll say something like best 2 out of 3. Now here's the life hack. You don't have to flip the coin 2 more times. You already know the answer. As soon as you say best 2 out of 3, your unconscious wanted the other result. It's very simple. So
and by flipping the coin 2 more times, you're playing that surrogate parent giving you permission. Whereas if you stop, you see forward 2 steps that you don't have to take, and you give yourself the permission. And that's I think that's then being unthreatened. And in that sense, it makes confidence walk the plank as the other side of the coin of shame. So you can eliminate those, because I think that's a great example where you see forward that no, okay, I had hoped for. Now you have to admit, you don't have to, but now you can look at it and admit that, oh no, I had a bias. I had a way I wanted to turn.
Yeah. So even though you might have this superstition about flipping a coin working, it actually does work, and it actually gives you your unconscious desire. It will do it every time without fail.
Mm-hmm. And that goes against the status quo of the structure of now I'm going to go 2 out of 3. That's the expectation. But the reality is you buck that little mini system and go, that told me that this is the other one. I didn't need this coin. Now I know. So the coin told me in the first flip what I wanted.
Exactly. That's the point. So Letitia says, Kuhn-Bader-Meinhof syndrome. This has been mentioned by Dr. Jung as a symptom of synchronicity. Okay, well, you'll need to tell us more about Kuhn-Bader-Meinhof syndrome. Have you ever heard of that, Jordan?
No, and it's parts of the roots are sounding familiar from something from Jung, but my German's not. I don't have a facility enough with German to translate the word.
Right. And I certainly have heard of Bader-Meinhof in a number of contexts, but
the Q part,
Letitia, if you will, give us a little bit more information about what the syndrome's symptoms are, that would be good. Or
even a translation, because the minor part, I can kind of get that, but the Q minor, it's qualified in the beginning with the prefix, and I haven't heard, and that could completely change the
Okay, so she said Q is for question. So
oh,
she asks whether that has been mentioned by Dr. Jung. I do not know. But in the collected works, which if you receive my most of my announcements about my sessions, I do include the link to our Dropbox. And in the Dropbox, you'll find the electronic version of all of the collected works of C.G. Jung. And so this is a life hack. You go to collected works in that Dropbox and go down to the bottom, you'll find volume 20. Volume 20 is entirely an index of all the other volumes. And volume 19 is entirely a bibliography of all the other volumes. So if you go to volume 20 and just look for Baader Meinhof through your word search on any browser, you will find out whether Jung mentioned it at all in his 20 works.
I looked. I mean, Baader Meinhof. It's funny. This is what I call yellow car syndrome. It's basically frequency bias. After noticing something for the first time, there is a tendency to notice it more often. Just like there were no yellow cars on the road to the dealership. I would swear in a court of law when I went to buy a car that day in 2005. And then I would walk in and there's a sunflower yellow. I mean, boom. I mean, little tiny, sprinty, teeny. I mean, my first question was, does it have 4 cylinders at least? It looks like it might have 3. Yeah. But then on the way home, I swear there must have been 50 yellow cars on the road. So that's Baader Meinhof, which is it's a frequency bias or a cognitive bias, where after noticing something for the first time, there's a tendency to notice it more often, leading someone to believe that it has an increased frequency of occurrence, when actuality, you just weren't able to see it until you saw it for the first time.
Okay, I'm just looking in the index of the,
and it's Baeder, Baader Meinhof.
I don't find it in the index of this book on synchronicity. So
I think what I would say is, from my understanding of the collected works, that Jung will speak of expectation, or he'll speak of predilection, or of bias, and the Baader Meinhof is, I think, just another way to look at that same thing, except more specifically that once seen, it can't be unseen, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But until you see it, it doesn't exist. So there's a certain quality of, just because you don't know a thing doesn't mean it's unknown.
Right. And in connection with these 2 paragraphs, I was thinking about how my intuitive nature, mind you, I test extremely intuitively on the Myers-Briggs test in the 99th percentile. And so I was thinking about people who go to museums, and a lot of people will be in tears when they're looking at images in museums, and I almost never am. And I think it's because once, the way I say it is that a intuitive person sees 3 trees and assumes there's a forest, and a sensing person on the other end of the extreme, 99th percentile, sensing would see 1,000 trees and not believe there's a forest. And so the point is, I think that when I look at pictures in a museum, I just tend to get an immediate overall impression of the picture, and then I move on. And so it hasn't really gotten into my emotional level. I just see the whole picture, and that's that. Whereas somebody who's extremely sensing might go and look at each little brushstroke and then get quite emotional about how the brush strokes are. And this happens to me when I'm analyzing a painting. If I take a original painting and I start to analyze it, man, I will see all kinds of things in that picture invariably, but I never see it on the first look. And then somehow it'll start to affect me. Like it's kind of like when Tim Holmes did my portrait a year ago, not this year's portrait, but last year's. And when I first opened it, because I hadn't specified anything about what it should look like with Tim, I just gave him free rein. When I first opened it, I didn't particularly like it. Okay, it seemed to me that I had a frown. It actually turned out to be a Mona Lisa smile, but when I first looked at it, it didn't look like I was happy. And my reaction to it was a comedy next time, Will, for first night, okay, which is a line from Shakespeare in Love, where Queen Elizabeth I is talking about a tragedy. She's talking about Romeo and Juliet, which is a tragedy, and she's telling William Shakespeare to write a comedy next time. Well, and so my first reaction to it was too much of a tragedy, this picture. But then it happened that I was recovering from one of my medical procedures, and so I was sleeping in our lazy boy chair in the living room, and a couple of times during the night, I walked past it. The first night it was there, and in the dark, without my spectacles on, I saw that this painting had depth and three-dimensionality, and that the face actually followed me, and it was like alive. Now, this is without my glasses, in the dark, and I'm seeing something about this picture that was alive. And that really affected me. And then when I started to look at it carefully, I found something like 55 connections to Carl Jung in that painting. And then the irony is, then when we did it in the advanced reading group, the group found another 50 that I hadn't even seen. And so, so the only image that I ever looked at was this Jackson Pollock, which was a drip painting. It didn't have any image in it, and it caused me to weep, and I didn't know why, and it took me 20 years to figure it out. And it touched me at a very unconscious level. And so most things don't touch me at that very unconscious level, because I tend to have a global view of things. So, and anyway, I don't know why
that olive drab, that olive drab had made an indelible impression on you, so that in a sense, that much military experience with olive drab made that conscious experience one of the unconscious or liminal cues as to what influence. They're kind of, in a sense, it's your crossing guard. I mean, it's nothing's getting in, nothing's getting out, without that being part of the discernment internally. Her bringing up Baader-Meinhof actually is interesting, because it brings to mind why the sensory overload, which is pretty much viscerally and visually gibberish most of the times, how it works. What it is they pop up something you haven't seen, so now you start to look for it, but then they take it away by popping something else up. And so in a sense, they keep you nipping on the, it's basically the old adage of tie a stick to a donkey's head and hang a carrot in front of it, and it'll walk forever until it realizes that the carrot's hanging there. But it does that even faster, I think, in modern advertising. Or, turn Instagram on. Well, the easiest way to get off of it is first to mute the sound, and then, because you get to a point where it's all movement, all sound. And so it almost tricks your mind into thinking you're in the rapids. You can't get out, except you can't just reach over and turn it off. So because it's the rapids are a fiction, but you do magnetically get drawn into that kind of sensory stimulus simply because of the stimulus. So without any discernment, people get hooked and stuck. Can go for 4 minutes and end up for 4 hours. I mean,
right. Okay, so let me read on here. 849. Here, I would like to call attention to a possible misunderstanding, which may be occasioned by the term synchronicity. I chose this term because the simultaneous occurrence of two meaningful but not causally connected events seem to me an essential criterion. I am therefore using the general concept of synchronicity in this special sense of a coincidence in time of two or more uncausally or causally unrelated events which have the same or a similar meaning, in contrast to synchronism, which simply means the simultaneous occurrence of two events. So, the significant thing is that you believe something is impossible, and then it happens. And that is certainly a synchronicity. And so, I see such things all the time because of my intuitiveness. And I've actually caught a few images of it. So it's just, to me, it's really, when it happens, it means that my unconscious was ready to recognize it when it happened. And, if I happen to have my cell phone next to me, I can take a picture of it. Or I happen to be running a video like this, and all of a sudden something happens in my room or Jordan's room or something, which is meaningful to us. It is pretty special, actually. So anyway.
Well, actually, it's interesting, kind of going back to the Bader-Meinhof. I think I get more intensely her question about, does Jung talk about it? Because the Bader-Meinhof becomes that synchronism, as it were, of the two coincidental events at the same time, except the difference with synchronicity is that it's two or more acausal, rather than just the synchronicity of, or the synchronism of two things. But with the Bader-Meinhof, you see something, you have the illusion that it's occurring more frequently, when in fact it actually had already been occurring and you just hadn't noticed.
Right. So
I think his synchronicity then speaks to more of a natural order of things that occur, rather than it's already occurring and you just simply hadn't noticed it, which there is crossover and overlappage there.
Okay, Justin did make the point that Jung died in 1961, but the Bader-Meinhof group wasn't formed until 1968. And then let's see. Then
we have to distinguish
Patrick is talking about this. Pardon?
We have to distinguish between the Red Army faction and then the Bader-Meinhof group. Which
we're not going to do because it's
because they're unrelated.
Right. All right. So Patrick is also talking about the 6 degrees of separation, and this is a phenomenon which I'm very familiar with, because I've been able to use it in my executive career. I don't know, probably hundreds of times, but the point is that we know everyone in the world by 6 degrees of separation. In other words, we know someone who knows someone who knows someone. And if you follow that lineage, you can get to everybody in the world. And I have been able to use that to my great advantage, because very often outside of the US, when I'm working outside of the US, I'm often working with people who in the US would be above my station. Okay. And so the result of that, and therefore I wouldn't know them in the US, but when I'm working overseas, because I'm sort of a unique character and an American business executive, I'm very often working above my level. And so the result of that is that I can get to, for example, the Prime Minister of India in one hop. Okay. In other words, I know somebody who knows the Prime Minister of India. I can get to the King of Saudi Arabia in one hop because I know somebody who knows him. And
oh, what was that? Look, Kevin Bacon, he's at the door.
right, something like that. And I don't know if I could get to Kevin Bacon in one hop. I can't probably, but I could probably get to him in two, I suppose. And this was experimentally. There's a book called The 6 Degrees of Separation, and if you haven't read it, you ought to read it, because when you read that and you realize that you know someone who knows someone, and that you can use that relationship, that is huge. That you can use that amazingly. So, for example, there is a company in India called Godrej, Godrej, Godrej Company. And everyone in India has some product from the Godrej Corporation. So everybody in India has in their home some product that is from the Godrej Corporation. Now, because of the things that I was doing, I ended up on the board of directors of my public company, the company that we took public. I ended up on the board of directors with the vice chairman, the brother of the chairman of the Godrej Corporation, for 10 years. And so we became quite good friends and learned a lot about one another. And he always knows the Prime Minister of India. So I always know that I can get to the Prime Minister of India if I want to, if I have something that would be of interest to the Prime Minister of India. Of course, that's the issue. But his wife is an Indian American, so a naturalized American, or not a naturalized. I think she was born in the U.S., but she was a doctor in the U.S. State Department. So through her, I can get to lots of people in the State Department. And so anyway, that isn't synchronicity. That's using a phenomenon that actually occurs in life. And if you understand that phenomenon, you can therefore use it to your advantage in many, many different cases, different ways.
Yeah, it's making connections by proximity and juxtaposition, so
Right.
that you couldn't one-on-one get to, so to speak, go knock on their door. But the fact that the electrical lines, so to speak,
Yeah.
of those 6 degrees of separation run from one person through their discernment to if they will, and then to the next if they do. So I think it's an interesting piece that takes out the if you remove discernment, you've got connection to everybody. And then you get your stopgaps and your blockages of, well, who do you have to interview or connect with further to have that line, that transmission continue up or down the line?
Well, and those people almost always come to me. I don't go to them to try to connect.
Right.
So I'll give an example. When I started doing business with India, the way I did it was I connected with someone who was Indian American, and he knew the son of the owner of a big shipping company in India. And I wanted to go to India to do business and find companies that would work with me in a very strange part of industry, which is medical transcription. And so he connected me with that guy. And so the first trip I made to Indian business, I was with that guy, and he took me into Software Technology Park, Bangalore, in its earliest days. Okay, now the amazing thing about that was, I mean, he knew a man named Mr. Varadan, who had founded the Software Technology Park in Bangalore, which is actually about 20 kilometers outside of Bangalore. So the first time I went with him, and we went on this car ride, incredible car ride, where the roads were very poor, and we went in an Ambassador, which was an Indian car at the time that was pretty tough. And so it was a bang ride out there. And we get there, and there's a 9-meter satellite dish. And so the first thing that happens to me is he says, "Would you like to check your email?" Now, this was in
now you have reception.
I think this is in 1991. And so being able to check my email from India was considered impossible at that time. But he said, "Oh, no, you can check it." And so I did. And then I said, "How'd you do that?" And he says, "Well, I did it through my satellite dish here." And he says, "Actually, we're one of the global stations for NASA. And so would you like to see the NASA mission that's going on right now?" And I said, "Oh my God, sure." And so we went into this blockhouse where the 9-meter dish was, and here these scientists were supporting a NASA mission, and it was like being in mission control. And I'm saying, how is that possible in India, where at the time they didn't even have cell phones, you know, or the public didn't have cell phones, and
kind of a gods must be crazy event. That little bottle in the middle of India.
Right. And then the next thing he took me to see was a clean room in a mainframe computer section of his building that, you know, one of the major computer companies that ran mainframes was running this huge mainframe in there. And this is so I'd gotten there, and I'd mainly seen the 12th century, because India is basically the 21st century, or that was the late 20th century, overlaid over the 12th century. And so mostly as you're riding along between places, often you're seeing the 12th century. And then to walk into this place, which was actually 20 kilometers outside of Bangalore, over a muddy dirt road full of ruts and holes, and all of a sudden walk into this ultra modern place like I'd never been in before, was just beyond belief. But that guy fell out of my life. Dr. Badadan introduced me to the head of STP Hyderabad, which was his counterpart in Hyderabad. And so I got to know him. And then Dr. Badadan died. Okay. And so here I am on the third person. And yet that person I still consider a good friend 30 years later. And I built a production center with him. So anyway, you often can do that. You can often make connections, and then people will come to you. And so once I made that connection in Hyderabad, then he said, "Oh, you have to talk to Seshu Kumar." And I said, "Okay." So the next day I'm having breakfast with Seshu Kumar, who's now been my friend for 26 years, and whose daughter I went to her wedding in 2013. And we've known each other all that time. And even though we've both had tough times, he told me recently, a couple months ago, that he is still supporting his family on something that he and I did together in 1996. An incredible story. So anyway, let's go on.
Well, actually, I think your story there really, I like the way it plays a distinction to the Bader-Meinhof piece, because the Bader-Meinhof piece then indicates that because you're seeing this thing more, you have the illusion that it's occurring more frequently, versus the discernment of actually seeing something maybe that you hadn't seen before, but then you know how to look for it in its actual occurrences, instead of just assuming that it's at a higher frequency. You dial in to let that higher frequency identify itself in a way that you can utilize it. Whereas I think Bader-Meinhof then skips stones. It keeps you on the surface instead of letting it be an indicator that, oh, well, there's something there, but don't believe it just because you see it.
Yeah, so you have to think about it like a jungle gym. You have to swing from one rail to the other. And I couldn't even name the first guy anymore. I don't remember his name right now. I mean, I could look it up and find it, but I don't remember offhand the name of that first guy I met. But that first guy I met introduced me to this Dr. Badadan, who I might have met him twice, but then he died. He was 52 years old and he got hepatitis or something and died. And so I thought he was this terrific connection for me, and he was gone. But by the time that happened, he had introduced me to this other person, and I was still working with this other person. And this other person introduced me to Seshu Kumar, who's been my very good friend for 30 years. And let's see, what was it? The first, second. So the third connection that I had is a person I still consider in my circle, one of quote unquote skips people by golden threads. And the fourth person he introduced to me is Seshu Kumar, whose parents are still supported on something that he and I did in 1996. Okay? So that, when you think about those connections in the 6 degrees of separation, Patrick, I really love that idea. And it's something that you really need to benefit from. And of course, Patrick, because he was at Confluence and because he knows something about metalworking, because he knew me from this, Patrick got to know Tim Holmes, who's the first American artist to show at the Hermitage in in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, the
Mhm.
first American artist to have a one-man show at the Hermitage. So he's a very eminent sculptor. And because Patrick knows me, he got to know Tim Holmes, and Tim Holmes is a metalworker, and Patrick is a metalworker. Now, where they take that relationship from there, I don't know, but that's 1 degree of separation between Patrick and Tim Holmes.
Mhm.
And Patrick's brother was also out there, and we got him a different connection that was actually 2 degrees of separation, because it was Tim who introduced Patrick's brother to another man who could help him if he knows how to cultivate that relationship. So that's exactly how these things work.
Mhm.
And I'm pretty sure that Patrick and his brother, I'm respecting anonymity here, because Patrick is a handle. Patrick Hollywood is a handle. I mean, I'm not giving his actual name nor his brother's actual name, but I'm pretty sure that they will be at our confluence again next October. And again, there will be other connections that will be very, very powerful for them, just because they do that. And so that's why you have to go out and meet people.
I'm glad Patrick brought up the 6 degrees of separation, and that also the Bader Meinhof was brought up. I think that I see a relationship between the two, where the 6 degrees of separation is the in actuality, three-dimensional living map. It's dynamic, it's topographical, it moves
Right.
up and down and in and out. Whereas the Bader Meinhof is then that two-dimensional view through a lens of the scene, but it's flat. So like you would draw a line on a USGS map, but if you
Yeah.
don't know how to read it, you're like, okay, you're hiking up 6,000 feet and hiking down 7,000 feet. And if you take this around, yeah, it's twice as long or 3 times as long, but it's the same elevation all the way around. It's an easier walk. So I think the Bader Meinhof is that seeing the map as flat,
Yeah.
but the 6 degrees of separation are all the things that actually in context connect.
Right. And I mean, we could use your yellow car example, whereas, you know, you could see you could see a yellow car park right in front of you as you're out for a walk.
Yeah.
And okay, so there's the yellow car syndrome. But if you then stop, and as the driver gets out, you say, here's this synchronicity, or Bader Meinhof syndrome thing, that I saw your yellow car, but did you know that blah, blah, blah? And all of a sudden you make a connection with that person.
Right.
And the depth of that relationship immediately leads you to some other good things in your life. And basically, this is how I have built my career, my international career, all the way along, was always by seeing the connections. And so this is, also why I'm doing these confluences, because the confluence has connected me with some very amazing creative people who not only are helping me continue to develop, and this is what we're talking about, where the transformation of the psychology of your psychology. My psychology is still transforming at age 76, and these people that I'm working with, especially, all the organizers of our confluence, there's 6 of us, have all helped me to grow in certain ways, and they've led to all kinds of new connections for me, including my connection to Patrick, which I really appreciate. And Patrick says, honestly, I cannot wait to do that skip. He means to come to California. It was such an amazing time. And so anyway, we should go on.
Okay.
So
I'll do
850.
paragraph 850.
Yep.
Synchronicity, therefore, means the simultaneous occurrence of a certain psychic state with one or more external events which appear as meaningful parallels to the momentary subjective state, and, in certain cases, vice versa. My two examples illustrate this in different ways. In the case of the scarab, the simultaneity is immediately obvious, but not in the second example. It is true that from the flock of birds occasioned a vague fear, but that can be explained causally. The wife of my patient was certainly not conscious beforehand of any fear that would be compared with my own apprehensions, for the symptoms, pains in the throat, were not of a kind to make the layman suspect anything bad. The unconscious, however, often knows more than the conscious, and it seems to me possible that the woman's unconscious had already got wind of the danger. If, therefore, we rule out a conscious psychic content, such as the idea of deadly danger, there is an obvious simultaneity between the flock of birds, in its traditional meaning, and the death of the husband. The psychic state, if we disregard the possible, but still not demonstrable, excitation of the unconscious, appears to be dependent on the external event. The woman's psyche is nevertheless involved insofar as the birds settled on her house and were observed by her. For this reason, it seems to me probable that her unconscious was in fact constellated. The flock of birds has as such a traditional mantic significance, and he has footnote 43, which is long enough to be, I think, important. A literary example of this mantic significance is the Cranes of Ibysus, inspired by the story of the Greek poet murdered by robbers who were brought to justice through the appearance of a swarm of cranes. As cranes had also flown over the scene of the crime, their murderers cried out at night and so betrayed themselves. Similarly, when a flock of chattering magpies settles on a house, it is supposed to mean death, and so on. You can also see significance of auguries. Mm-hmm. So moving on to the paragraph, this is also apparent in the woman's own interpretation, and it therefore looks as if the birds represented an unconscious premonition of death. The physicians of the Romantic age would probably have talked of sympathy or magnetism, but as I've said, such phenomena cannot be explained causally unless one permits oneself the most fantastic ad hoc hypotheses.
Right.
Which would mean thrown together hypotheses.
Right.
Hypotheses.
So I'll go on here. The interpretation of the birds as an omen is, as we have seen, based on two earlier coincidences of a similar kind. It did not yet exist at the time of the grandmother's death. There, the coincidence was represented only by the death and the gathering of the birds. Both then and at the mother's death, the coincidence was obvious. But in the third case, it could only be verified when the dying man was brought into the house. 852. I mention these complications because they have an important bearing on the concept of synchronicity. Let us take another example. An acquaintance of mine saw and experienced in a dream the sudden death of a friend with all the characteristic details. The dreamer was in Europe at the time and the friend in America. The death was confirmed next morning by telegram, and 10 days later, a letter confirmed the details. Comparison of European time with American time showed that the death occurred at least an hour before the dream. The dreamer had gone to bed late and not slept until about 1 o'clock. The dream occurred at approximately 2 in the morning. The dream experience is not synchronous with the death. Experiences of this kind frequently take place a little before or after the critical event. J.W. Dunn mentions a particularly instructive dream he had in the spring of 1902 when serving in the Boer War. He seemed to be standing on a volcanic mountain. It was an island which he had dreamed about before and knew just was threatened by a catastrophic volcanic eruption like Krakatoa. Terrified, he wanted to save the 4,000 inhabitants. He tried to get the French officials on the neighboring island to mobilize all available shipping for the rescue work. Here, the dream began to develop the typical nightmare motifs of hurrying, chasing, and not arriving on time. And all the while, there hovered before his mind the words, 4,000 people will be killed unless. A few days later, Dunn received with his mail a copy of the Daily Telegraph, and his eye fell on the following headlines: Volcano disaster in Martinique, town swept away, an avalanche of flame, probably loss of over 40,000 lives. Okay. The dream did not take place at the moment of the actual catastrophe, but only when the paper was already on its way to him with the news. While reading it, he misread 40,000 as 4,000. The mistake became fixed as a paramnesia, so that whenever he told the dream, he invariably said 4,000 instead of 40,000. Not until 15 years later, when he copied out the article, did he discover his mistake. His unconscious knowledge had made the same mistake in reading as himself.
Yeah, and there's him falling prey to Bader Meinhof.
Right. Okay. So
he misremembered the paramnesia.
Okay. Why don't you read into the next paragraph?
Yeah, because it's related.
Yeah.
The fact that he dreamed this shortly before the news reached him is something that happens fairly frequently. We often dream about people from whom we receive a letter by the next post. I have ascertained on several occasions that at the moment when the dream occurred, the letter was already lying in the post office of the addressee. I can also confirm from my own experience the reading mistake. During the Christmas of 1918, I was much occupied with Orphism, and in particular with the Orphic fragment in Malalas, where the primordial light is described as the Trinitarian metis, phones, Erysipeus. I consistently read Erysipeus instead of Erysipeus, as in the text. Actually, both readings occur. This misreading became fixed as a paramnesia, and later I always remembered the name as Erysipeus with an A in the middle and rather than E, and only discovered 30 years afterwards that the Malalas text has Erysipeus with an E in the middle. Just at this time, one of my patients, whom I had not seen for a month and who knew nothing of my studies, had a dream in which an unknown man handed her a piece of paper, and on it was written a Latin hymn to a god called Erysipeus with an I in the middle. The dreamer was able to write this hymn down upon waking. The language it was written in was a peculiar mixture of Latin, French, and Italian. The lady had an elementary knowledge of Latin, knew a bit more Italian, and spoke French fluently. The name Erysi, with an I in the middle, Peus, was completely unknown to her, which is not surprising, as she had no knowledge of the classics. Our two towns were about 50 miles apart, and there had been no communication between us for a month. Oddly enough, the variant of the name affected the very same vowel, which I too had misread, A instead of E, but her unconscious misread it another way, I instead of E. I can only suppose that she unconsciously read, not my mistake, but the text in which the Latin transliteration Euripius with an E occurs and was evidently put off her stroke by my misreading.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good pause
yeah.
there, because that really, I think, well, the synchronicity of misreading that made my pen go away. Oh well.
Okay.
Don't know where
All
that
right.
went.
I think we've done our duty for today. And since I need to vacate the space here directly, let's see. Letitia's talking about precognitive dreams. Yes, we often have them. And she says, when my mom died, a hurt bird came in my room shortly before. Many indigenous peoples believe in these signs. I do too. Yeah, we have these very often. And
it's interesting there with, I believe in them too. Personally, I don't believe in them. I simply experience them. And I think belief and disbelief really get in the way of creating unfortunate visual bias, because someone will see something, but I'm not gonna, I don't subscribe to that, kind of thing. And there's the
people will palm it off instead of paying attention to it.
And I find that those who protest too much, I'm going, wow, they are just so full of so many false synchronicities built on that they have systematically created something that is a whole culture, but it's completely based on lies. And we will only see things this way, which means they miss the crucial connections of the things that are pretty anomalous, which actually give things life.
Yeah, I just want to see if something will come up if I all right, it sort of does. So I'm going to talk about this a little bit. We simply don't know what we don't know about communication between people, creatures, and so on. And so what I want to refer to is the idea of an aura, which you can see around people's heads, especially when you look at them, like in Jordan's case, as we're looking up at Jordan, and he has behind him a sort of what we see as kind of a grayish brown color in the ceiling of his room, but we can see a lighter patch that is around Jordan's head and which follows his head. Well, that is actual energy. And, you can see it around my head a little less, but very often in the dark, we all can see auras if we believe we can see them. And so the way I teach people to see an aura is I say, in a dark room, put your hands together like this. Let me do it over here so you can see. And you do see connections. You actually see it here between my fingers. I don't know. Can you pick up on it right there? My forefinger, my left forefinger, and my right forefinger. You can see an extra color or something that's picked up by the camera right there. Can you see that?
Hold on.
Okay, so you see you see an extra color that's picked up by the camera there that is sort of a beigeish green, I guess. But if you do this with your fingers in a dark room, lying on your back, just look up at the ceiling with your fingers and move them back and forth like that, you'll see this aura that simply looks like taffy between your fingers. Well, that aura is actual energy that is around your head, and or around between your fingers. You can actually see, you can move your fingers up and down. Let me see here. You can see it
Right.
connecting between my fingers. If I get them close enough, it'll connect, and then you move it up and down, and it moves up and down with you like taffy.
Well, and I put the same background screen as you, just to show. And if you'll see, like back over, you can see that. Well, I'm not out in the wind. That's not my hair blowing or anything. I mean,
Right.
that's what I think is cool about photography and videography like this is it's picking up on things that are there.
Yeah.
And it amplifies what often we may see, but we don't notice.
Right. And so, for people that have fancier equipment like cable television stations, you don't tend to see it as much because they argue it out, but you can really see it going around Jordan's head now.
Now look at this. I put up my house of my thesis. Now it's all over.
Yeah.
Well, that's a specially resonant image. So, I see that, and I'm activated in a way. So it's interesting that, I put the other one that you had on. I like it, but it's there. But, you only saw kind of the modification back here. But in this one, you see it's having a hard time picking up where I stop and the image starts.
Yeah, I'm just checking to see if one of these others does a better job with me. I guess it doesn't. But, the point is, with no trouble whatsoever, if you lie in your bed looking up at your ceiling, which is usually a nondescript color, and you just move your fingers like this, you will see this energy moving up and down like taffy. And you can spread it apart and it'll get thinner, and you bring it together and it'll get thicker, and so on. And then you're absolutely convinced. And I remember when this started to come up in sort of the new agey stuff years ago, Debbie and I were sitting in a dark living room, and she was sitting across from me in the living room, and she said, "Well, can you see auras?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I can see them all the time. And I see the big aura around your head right now." And she said, "You can?" And, but the fact is that you can. And my point about this,
I don't use I try not to use the backgrounds, because look at this.
Yeah.
And it's cool right now, but if we had that for 2 hours, it's distracting to people.
Right.
So I end up, and I laugh that I end up going, well, this may be, not the prettiest, but then you're not distracted by, oh, my head's doing this.
Yeah, but there is a light colored aura around your head.
There is, but it's not so visually obviously active.
Right. Right. And so my point about all this, which we need to close on, is that, when we talk about preconditions and precognitive dreams and such, they're real. Those things are real. And Dr. Jung talked about the time that he was on a train going home, and he fell asleep, and he had a dream that had a young boy drowning. And he got home, and everybody was in a fluster because his grandson had almost drowned in his boathouse. And so, there are connections like that science cannot explain yet. And what we can say about it is that it exists. And
and I think that's important, even with the comment about, the experience that occurred and with after her mom, and with that piece, and and then she followed with, and I believe those things. And I think that's kind of where the danger lies, is that I appreciate that she shared that and that it happened, and then not needing to believe those things where people park into belief. Like even some people step up to my tarot table and they say, oh, I don't believe in all this. I said, good, that makes two of us. I don't believe in it either, any more than I believe in my range or my fridge in my kitchen, but I use them every day to nourish myself. And so you can dispense with the belief pretty simply. And that way you don't have to worry about being convinced that that did not happen to you.
Yep.
And then you keep it, and you keep it without any reason whatsoever, simply because you do know that it did occur.
Right.
I mean, and that's
and
important.
just for the record, jordanhogger.com is where you can learn about having Jordan do your tarot reading, which I'm sure is very powerful, because whatever happens, every tarot reading does make a connection with you. If as long as you give it the benefit of the doubt, and that there's no question about that. We can't predict what it would be. Jordan can't predict what it would be, but if he simply gives you a plain vanilla reading, it will connect with you.
And to clarify too, the jordanhogger.com is really more my personal library of Alexandria of about 5 blogs. And then the tarot divination studio architecture well-being site is Sandbox Psyche, SANDBOXPSYCE, sandboxpsyche.com. And there's a scheduling app or scheduling feature there too. But the jordanhogger.com, I've kind of primarily made the secondary site of blogs primarily.
Right. Okay. Well, I wanted to give Jordan an opportunity to mention that to everyone because we don't often do it. And I do not do tarot readings very often. Sometimes I do it for friends. And it's simply because I just don't have the time to focus on the tarot, whereas Jordan has focused on it from a professional perspective, and so you would be a lot better off going to him, or if you wanted a woman reader, you might go to Melissa Townsend, or I can give you other names of people who are outstanding tarot readers, and it actually works, and it is a step between, as I say it, maintaining your mental health. You do that through conversation with your friends, or by coming here and listening to us murmur on for a couple of hours, and that helps you see that you're normal and you're seeing things too, and so that means that you're not crazy. Okay. And so
in the wrong way.
Right. So right. I mean, there are mental diseases and defects, but psychology is basically about just having your psyche in such a way that it needs to have an adjustment. And so sometimes that adjustment can just come from a conversation with your friends over coffee. Sometimes it takes something like a divination, like Jordan does, or like tea reading, or Jordan also does astrology. So all of those things. And then, sometimes you need a professional psychologist to help you. And we're not professional psychologists. I'm not, but I do.
No, and I've stopped putting tarot in the middle. I had a psychologist sit down last week, and his wife, who's also a psychologist, and right before them, a psychiatrist had sat down. Now, I didn't know they were until 3/4 of the way through, when they kind of let on, and they apologized that they should have told me before, but they only apologized that they should have told me before because they started learning things where they would put something out and about confidence. And I'm like, well, shouldn't you lose the confidence? Just become naturally unthreatened, because confidence is the other side of the coin of shame.
Mhm.
And, immediately there was the psychologist, immediately 3/4 of the way through, he goes, wow, your presentation is, do you mind if I take notes? I said, no, not at all. But the thing is, what I realized is because of the Jungian focus and understanding psychology enough to be dangerous, as it were, I'm not going to present myself as a psychologist, that there became an allied field rather than I'm sitting below on a diagram. And it's interesting to me because it was different professional for different application. But when I've fully 60% of my clients, and if not more, are Jungian analysts, psychologists, and psychiatrists. And so I laugh when I'm giving relationship or business advice to someone who is a psychological professional. That makes me smile.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's fair enough. I think you're probably right with someone who is as professionally capable at it as you are. When people are, when young girls do it in high school or something like that, though, then you have to be a little careful. But I do
and I
concur
won't
with
meet
you.
people under 18 unless their parents are right there. That's because the thing about that is they're still moving so fast in development. They'll walk away, and 50 feet later, they'll misremember it differently than they misremembered it when they got up. And by the time the grapevine comes back around, they're like, "Oh, he said this," and then "Oh, no, I didn't." No, nothing near. So
yeah. Okay.
But I also find that they are very pure in a way with how well they get things, because they're not laden with all these I should, woulda, shoulda, coulda, believed this, that. They'll call BS on stuff and go, no, not so much, because they still are just right prior to that stage of pesky idealism. So honestly, they're probably the best judge of what's healthy for them than anyone. Because they're just going to go, no, that doesn't sound very good.
Yeah. Okay. Well, yes, and my 7th graders are like that too. And so I can learn a lot from them because they let it all hang out. Anyway, peace. Take care. See you tomorrow later.
Good.
And I'll tell you how my interview went tomorrow.
Nice. I look forward to it.
Bye-bye. Take care. Peace, everyone.